There are always going to be challenges that come up. There's always going to be things that are going on in our life that get us stuck. And we're always going to be trying to change and grow and meet the challenges that come our way. So as human beings, it's a natural state of being to experience stuckness, and we're designed to be able to move out of stuckness and grow from the process. Hi everyone, welcome to my first live. I'm Esti Marcus, a licensed clinical social worker. I'm just going to begin. I have a private practice in Brooklyn and online, and I specialize in treating trauma in adults, helping people move out of stuckness. So tonight's topic is moving out of stuckness, and it's a topic that I'm really passionate about because it's usually what brings people into therapy. Either it's the symptoms that come with stuckness, or it's the distress of noticing stuckness that usually brings someone in for therapy. And it's something that I end up working with a lot. In general, I think that our life's work is about moving out of stuckness. There are always going to be challenges that come up. There's always going to be things that are going on in our life that get us stuck. And we're always going to be trying to change and grow and meet the challenges that come our way. So as human beings, it's a natural state of being to experience stuckness, and we're designed to be able to move out of stuckness and grow from the process. One of the things that I end up encountering a lot in my trauma work, and one of the things that makes it that people end up coming in for therapy with regards to stuckness, is that some people have challenges with getting stuck in stuckness. In other words, stuckness is a part of life, and we're meant to learn how to safely and effectively move in and out of stuckness as it comes up. But sometimes we don't actually learn how to do that, or we don't learn effective methods how to do that. And so what ends up happening is that we need help learning how to move in and out of stuckness. And so I like to think of therapy as helping people who are stuck in stuckness move out and learn how to move out of stuckness. Now, at the end of this live and at certain milestones in therapy, it does not mean that you're no longer going to ever get stuck. Because again, that's part of life. Stuckness is something, it's a human experience. Stuckness could be interchanged with challenges or things that are obstacles that we find ourselves having difficulty moving through. So it's not going to result in not getting stuck ever, but the goal is for you to have a pattern or a method or an imprint that lets you know that moving out of stuckness is doable. It's possible. And using that approach to move through stuckness allows for a certain level of ease and a sense of competency and an awareness of our own effectiveness as human beings to be able to move in and out of stuckness. So I want to go into this a little bit more deeply. I categorized stuckness into 5 different categories, and I'm going to go through each of the categories of stuckness. I'll give an example of each category, and then I'll give, I guess I would say, a solution or something that you could I guess I would call it a practice, something that you could practice that could help you move out of stuckness in each of these areas. So the first category of stuckness that I want to talk about is trauma. Trauma is a very overused word. A lot of people like to talk about it, but it is something that comes up a lot. The way that I'm going to define trauma for this discussion is that trauma could be interchanged with understanding it as stuck energy. That when we experience something very life-threatening, there's energy that comes into our system to help us survive. And if we're not able to utilize that energy to help us survive, it can get stuck in the system, which often means that every time that similar stimuli occurs and our nervous system picks up on that stimuli, it thinks that it's in a same situation, and it produces the same energy. It utilizes that same energy to try to get you out of it. And that means that there's energy in your system that is stuck and kind of circulating in this repeating pattern that almost is like a skipping record player. So the work there is to, of course, move out of those repeated reactions because they are no longer either appropriate to have those reactions. And when I say appropriate, I don't mean that there's something wrong with us if we have that reaction. I mean that the situation isn't calling for that kind of reaction. So we want to be able to learn different ways to react. But if there's these patterns that are already imprinted in our system, it may be pretty difficult to access a different kind of reaction. An example of this kind of stuckness would be a freeze response. Let's say you were a child growing up and people in positions of power over you talked very aggressively and angrily toward you, and that really scared you and maybe put you in a dangerous position, so that there could have been a lot of energy in your system to fight or flee the situation, but you couldn't exercise that energy. So instead you're stuck in a freeze response. So there could be a repeating pattern where anytime someone reminds you of that original experience where they're talking aggressively or very angrily, or maybe it was a man who had that original experience with you, or it was a woman or a teacher or someone in the clergy who had that original experience with you, and it could be that anytime you engage with someone that reminds your nervous system of that original experience, it activates that freeze response, and it could keep on activating, creating stuckness of that energy in your system. So one of the ways here are some ways that we can move out of that kind of stuckness. Yoga, slow movement practices are very helpful for moving that stuck energy out of your system or in different places. Sometimes the stuck energy gets stuck in a specific location in your body, like we often experience like back or shoulder or neck pain, especially when we're having stuck energy trauma responses or gut issues. So some active, mindful practice of movement can be really helpful in moving some of that stuck energy, especially for a freeze response. So creating a practice around that can be very helpful. Yoga is an example, or mindful movement. And somatic therapy has been very helpful for moving and discharging stuck energy. And some examples of somatic therapy are somatic experiencing, sensory motor psychotherapy. There are some healing practices that integrate yoga and movement and somatic experiencing. So those are some examples that can really help a person move out of stuckness that is a result of trauma. The second category of stuckness is not necessarily trauma related. So it doesn't have to be that someone experienced something deeply traumatizing or dangerous to their nervous system in order for them to be stuck in stuckness. But the second category is repetition. The things that we repeat the most, we can get stuck in, especially because if we have been repeating it the most frequently as a reaction to something, our nervous system, our bodies, our minds may learn to think that that's the only reaction possible. It becomes so second nature that it feels instinctive. And when we have instincts, we think that there's no other choice, that that's the only option that we have. And so the same way that if someone were to come very close to my eyes very quickly, I would blink. That is instinct. If we have a reaction, the same reaction to something every single time it happens, we may think that that's an instinct when it's really just repetition. An example of that is if someone just reacts to someone who's in a position of power by submitting or deferring without considering whether they're someone who should be submitted to. If they have other options, do they have to automatically trust someone just because they're in a position of power? Just because someone's in a position of power, or their teacher or their therapist or their doctor, doesn't automatically make them an authority over us. So if we find that we automatically are engaging in certain patterns, perhaps it's due to just that's the repetition that we got used to. We started at a young age engaging in that way, and then we kept on repeating it and repeating it until it became second nature. So one of the ways of understanding whether it's repetition or it's instinct is to find out if it's human nature or it's your nature. In other words, do all human beings or most human beings have that reaction, or do only some human beings have that reaction? If only some human beings have that reaction, chances are it's a learned response that came from repetition, and it's not necessarily an instinctive response. Some of the ways of moving out of that can help you with repetition, stuckness caused by repetition, is by pausing, allowing yourself to have a moment of pause before you react. Even if you're going to react the exact same way that you had instinctively intended to, allowing yourself that breathing room, that moment to pause, can really add a lot to what choices you end up making. It can begin to teach your nervous system that actually it's not automatic. It doesn't have to be that response. You can teach your system that there's other possibilities. So if you have a really hard time with this, you can start with a smaller pause and grow into a bigger pause. So for some people that will start with a 5-minute pause. For some people that will be a 5-second pause, depending on the situation, whatever it is, to stretch out of your comfort zone a little bit by inserting a pause. Another example of a pause would be if you find yourself agreeing to things without giving yourself a chance to think it over. Allow yourself to have a script on hand to respond to requests from other people. So someone requests something from you, have it ready that you say, let me think about it. Have it ready that you can respond to questions that people ask you with, great question, let me give it some thought and get back to you. So allow yourself that breathing room and that pause that really helps with interrupting the patterns that have become ingrained in us. The third category is that often we utilize a temporary solution, or what was meant to be a temporary solution, but we held on to that solution long term, and it operates as a solution only temporarily. And when we utilize the same solution long term, it actually ends up interfering with our effectiveness, and it can often hinder our effectiveness. An example of that, just outside of a psychic or interpersonal or therapeutic kind of world, it's like having a leak and using tape to hold the leak. That could be a very effective temporary solution until the plumber is able to come. But if you keep on putting tape on the leak long term, eventually there's going to be a lot bigger issues than just that leak. So we want to make sure that whatever solutions we're using were not temporary solutions that were made into long-term solutions. An example of that often is things that we needed to do in order to survive, that we may have engaged in these choices or behaviors in childhood because they were the best option or they were a temporary solution. For example, prioritizing the adult caretaker's needs over our own needs, that may have been really important as a temporary solution to getting our needs met or feeling safe or being safe, but it's not meant to be a long-term solution. Once we're adults and once we're not under the care of, we're not vulnerable to specific caretakers, we need to be able to move out of those solutions and use more effective options. So few ways to help with moving out of this kind of stuckness is to experiment. I love the idea of experimenting. I talk about it all the time with my clients, and experimenting allows us to try something different, see what happens. in small doses. We're not trying to completely transform. We're not going to transform, and we're not going to move out of stuckness by doing something very intense or too much for the system. We want to do a little bit at a time. So a great way to do that is to experiment with doing mini experiments. So if we're used to, for example, always putting someone else's needs in front of our own, we might experiment in a safe enough relationship to see what happens if I don't defer to the other person. If someone says, "What are you in the mood to do?" and we don't respond with "whatever you want," and we take a risk and we do an experiment and see what happens if I say, "I want to do this today," and not ask what the other person wants. This is obviously as a way of experimenting and moving out of stuckness, and not meant to be what you always have to do, or the goal is not to become self-centered in this. The goal is to be able to stretch and expand beyond the limitations of that stuckness. The fourth category of stuckness, and I apologize as I'm speaking, I know I'm speaking fast, there's a lot I want to cover, and maybe this will turn into a part one if there's more that comes up out of that. So the fourth category of stuckness is stuckness that's similar to the repetition. It's similar to things that we've talked about before, but it's stuckness and patterns of behavior that we may have learned that were just not effective. So we learned from teachers. Often those teachers are our parents as we're young children. We may have learned from people who learned from people who learned from people who weren't using the most effective methods. So it became like tradition of this is how we approach things, but it's not necessarily the most effective approach. It's just the one that was available and what was passed down from generation to generation and what we learned how to do. And an example of that might be responding with passive aggressive responses to anger or conflict. We may have learned to respond by blunting our anger and not effectively communicating. And these are methods that may have been effective at one time, may not have been effective at other times. They may have never been effective, but it's really about no one ever was able to learn how to do it. So there's no one to blame in that. Sometimes it's life circumstances that don't allow us to fully learn the skills that we need to learn in order to effectively. That's often the reality. And even people who were raised by people who really knew what they were doing, or we were exposed to role models who could teach us things to effective ways of behaving, we still there could have been lessons that were learned that were not the most effective. So one of the ways that we can work with this kind of stuckness is to expose ourselves to more ways of learning, to move beyond just our limited scope of role models of who taught us things, and find out how other people are operating in the world. A great way of learning about effectiveness and how other people might navigate relationships and different kinds of behaviors is group therapy. And I'm a big fan of group therapy because it gives you that opportunity to both observe other people and how they are communicating. So you get to see in real time what effective communication or ineffective communication can look like. And then you also have hopefully a safe enough space for you to practice different ways of communicating or engaging with the world. So group therapy, and of course, taking chances and experimenting, like I talked about before, taking chances in safe enough environments so that you could try something different, so that your system can learn that there are different ways of engaging with the world. The fifth category of stuckness, and the last one that I'm going to talk about tonight, is a lot of times we become stuck because we're operating in a vacuum. We experience the struggle the challenge and we came up with the solution. And we only ever consulted with ourselves to come up with the solution. So in this example, I'm not saying that the only person that can help you out of stuckness is a therapist, but I am saying that in these examples, the only thing that can help you out of stuckness is someone else, someone to consult with, someone who you can trust to consult with honestly, because you can't move out of this kind of stuckness in a bubble. If you were able to move yourself out of stuckness with your own solutions, you would have been able to do it. You wouldn't be stuck. So it's really important to ask for help and to consult with someone who you trust to be able to move out of this kind of stuckness. So I did want to speak fast enough so that I could get to some of the questions that were submitted. And so I'm going to go over, I do think that I covered a lot of the topics related to the questions that were submitted, but I want to make sure that I go over them. So one of the questions was from someone who she writes, they write, I have been divorced for 7 years and can't seem to get past the hurt, trauma, anger, and death of a marriage that I thought would be until I died. How can I move on and live a happy and healthy life without depression and sadness? So firstly, I want to just acknowledge that the end of a marriage or the end of any relationship is a really painful experience. And of course, there's a lot of emotions that come with it, and there's a grief that needs to be processed with regards to ending a relationship. But I want to focus on the last part of the question, which is how can I move on and live a happy life without depression and sadness? Now, I don't know how to answer that because I don't think it's possible to live life without sadness, because sadness is an emotion that we have in reaction to experiences that we have. The topic for tonight, though, is about not getting stuck in sadness. And stuck in sadness, or stuck in trying to repress sadness, is what depression is, or one way of looking at depression. So the goal of this kind of work, I would recommend, would be to process the grief and to begin by accepting or acknowledging that part of this process will be that you will be feeling sad, a lot of other feelings, but the goal is that you are moving through the feelings rather than moving on from the feelings or moving away from the feelings. We are trying to move through them, and when we move through them, we aren't getting stuck in them. So to think of your feelings that are coming up as a result of the ending of the relationship as like a swimming pool. And what you want to be able to do is to swim through the pool, but not to have the pool the place where you live now. You live in your home and then you go swimming in the pool. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying is to acknowledge and try your best to accept that a lot of these emotions are going to be part of the process of healing, and not to move away from them, but to try to allow yourself to feel it in small doses. So we don't want to be wallowing in it, but we want to be able to stretch our boundaries or to stretch our capacity to feel a little bit at a time. And usually a therapist can help with that. The second question that I have here is, how do I know if I'm stuck? Is everyone always stuck on some level? So I think I did answer that earlier, that stuckness is a human condition. I see stuckness as a human condition, but getting stuck in stuckness is not a human condition. And that's something to get help for. If you find yourself stuck in stuckness, that may mean that you never had a model or experienced or had an experience of effectively moving through stuckness. So you don't know, or your system, your nervous system, doesn't know that there's a way through stuckness. So every time stuckness comes up, your system kind of panics and says, oh no, this is where I'm going to live now. And then it tightens against it. So part of that work is to learn and to have an experience of being able to effectively move out of stuckness. So that doesn't mean that you're never going to get stuck again. It just means that you have a pattern for moving out of stuckness. And we're just at our last minute. So I'll get to one final question here, which is getting out of stuckness an external thing or more internal? then they say, can you make it practical? So I hope I made it practical by giving examples for each of those categories of what you can do for moving out of stuckness. But in terms of external or internal, I'm not sure 100% what you mean by that. I guess I'm thinking about it internal and external, but also alone versus with other people. So internal, I think it's a combination, just like everything is a combination of things. I think that the biggest part of moving out of stuckness happens through practice and taking chances. So that I guess I would categorize as external. It's something like behavioral, where you need to put something into practice. However, it's very hard to take chances when we don't feel safe. So that I would think of as, so first we need to feel safe enough, then we need to take risks, then we need to take in that information that we get from taking risks, and then build our sense of safety and take risks. And I think it's a beautiful dance of internal, external, self-introspection, and consultation and working with others. So that's all we have time for tonight. I see that there are some other questions here, like about shame. I'd love to get to those, but I do only have this half hour and I don't want to go over time. So maybe we'll do a second part. But I do encourage you to send any further questions. You could send it to OKclarity or to my Instagram, and I'm at LCSW. It's been really nice to talk with you all tonight, and I hope you have a good night.